In this hour with Lieutenant General David Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. General Deptula, of course, retired Lieutenant General in the Air Force. Good morning, General. How are you?
Hey, very good, Hugh. How are you doing today?
Great. You know, I always assume that my two flag officers who are retired, you and Admiral Stavridis, who come on, are always reading because I've never met a flag officer, retired or on active duty, who wasn't a reader. So I've been reading this book, Freedom's Forge, by Arthur Herman, about how America went from 0 to 100 miles an hour in war production. I mean, 250,000 bombers in 5 years, bombers and fighters. It's astonishing. And I am curious as we approach VE Day. General Deptula. This is you never know what I'm going to ask you, right? You just show up here and I throw stuff at you.
No, I don't, which drives me nuts, but that's okay. I enjoy it.
Well, here's the deal. I know you've been reading your whole life. When you read about air power in World War II, do you think who was right? Who predicted its role, which was neither decisive but without which a necessary but sufficient condition to win the war was air power? Who got it right back then?
Holy cow. Well, there are a lot of people, I think, immediately back to, and I think you had mentioned a naval officer who, if forgive me, I can't remember the name, but may have been a relative of yours, who forecast what happened at Pearl Harbor. There's another guy who's pretty famous that people don't recall forecast Pearl Harbor over a decade before it happened, and that is the namesake of our institution, General Billy Mitchell.
Oh, I didn't know that Mitchell was, Joe Tossig was my wife's grandfather, and he got fired by FDR for saying that in a Senate hearing. I didn't know Billy Mitchell saw it coming.
Absolutely. It was over a decade in advance. He was out there in the Pacific, and he foretold what was going to happen. So Mitchell was one of the greatest advocates for the applicability of air power. He started very young. He caused a lot of consternation, but he got things done. Now, he was early on, but when you get to the actual war, one of the great books out there is entitled A Few Great Captains. There's another one called Winged Victory by Geoffrey Perot. That gives insights into the incredible work that the men and women. Now, men only flew in combat during that time, but the women, back to the book that you just mentioned, were critical in building the industrial base, the United States, that got to the point where they were turning out bombers at more than one in every few minutes.
It's an amazing story. In fact, Doolittle, General Doolittle, was on a tour with, it was then Major Doolittle, with Bill Knudsen, who was in charge of all this before Pearl Harbor. And he said, this is great, but we're going to have to triple, quadruple, and quintuple what we're doing. And people looked at him like they were nuts. And yet America was able to do that. And if we hadn't done it, we wouldn't have ruled the skies.
No, it's absolutely true. And you mentioned Jimmy Doolittle. He's another stalwart, which was just an incredible individual, not to mention the bravery of leading the Doolittle raid off the carrier Hornet in April of 1941, which just completely shocked the Japanese and boosted the morale of America. And then, of course, the other individual I've got to mention is General Hap Arnold, who oversaw the entire effort, and just a fascinating individual. I mean, there's so much that we can learn from history that, as you mentioned, is important, because if we don't read it, we're bound to maybe not replicate it completely, but history certainly has a rhyme with what's going on today.
General Deptula, one of the things I've been listening to this book and thinking about, Stanley Baldwin, as the British Prime Minister in the 30s, said the bomber will always get through, and the fighter proved that that wasn't the case. They couldn't bring Britain to their knees with the bomber. At the same time, Curtis LeMay and others thought the bomber will drive the enemy to their knees. That wasn't true either. Since that original standoff, which is it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to victory, has any basic recognition of air power changed?
Yeah, I saw that what happened in if you advance from World War II to what occurred in Desert Storm. The early forefathers of air power had theories, and they believed what could be accomplished from the air in terms of getting to the heart of an adversary, crippling his leadership, paralyzing his ability to operate, immobilizing their military. Well, the accuracies in World War II simply didn't allow that to happen. By the time we got to Desert Storm, technology had gotten to the point where it realized the theories of early pioneers. So in Desert Storm, it was a 43-day operation. Air power and air power alone operated for the first 40 of those 43 days. And it wasn't until the end, after the Iraqi military had completely been collapsed and forced to disengage, that we went in with ground forces to reoccupy the country of Kuwait that the Iraqis have invaded. But that was a war that was completely dominated by air power. So, yeah, we need all of our forces, but given the conditions of a particular situation, air power can be decisive, and it has been before. The other example is Operation Allied Force in 1999, where air power brought Milosevic to his knees and completed that operation without any other surface forces being involved. So,
Yeah, General, after every time you're on, I always get an email from my buddy, a retired Marine Corps general, who always says, boy, Deptula was great, but he didn't say blank, blank, blank. And it's always about the fact you got to have someone banging the door. I mean, it's always about that. So like clockwork, I'm going to hear that today about how Kosovo.
Well, that's fine. Listen, the fact of the matter is, where we've gotten today is the air power is the indispensable force. There are no joint force operations, period, without some element of air and space power being involved. And then think about that. You can't say that about any other service.
That's true. Now, I do want to ask you before we run out of time. Victory in Europe was necessary because of the unmanned V1 and V2. I mean, they were just killing civilians left and right. I saw this week that Boeing trotted out a giant unmanned freight vehicle. I mean, giant. Is the future, General Deptula, that we're not going to need pilots for anything anymore?
No, it's not. And by the way, yours truly was the one that oversaw for 4 years the dramatic increase in unmanned vehicles in the Air Force between 2006 and 2010. So there's not a bigger advocate of unmanned aerial vehicles in the military than I. But we will always have human beings in aircraft and spacecraft, whether or not it's technologically feasible to extract them, simply because we have not gotten to the point where we've been able to automate decision-making capability better than the gray matter that resides between a human being's two ears.
Isn't that just a matter of time, though, General, when AI catches up?
Not within our lifetimes. And I go back to, let's look at the psychological piece. Hugh, are you going to be comfortable walking on an airplane once we are able to fly again, and look to the left where the cockpit is and see nothing, and then going back and sit down?
Well, that's how I've done my radio show for years. I look in the producer's room and there's nothing. So I honestly, I don't know. When you come back next week, let's talk about this, because I think AI and flight. If we can have driverless cars, I'm a lot happier with a driverless airplane than a driverless car, because there's nobody in between, right?
Okay, how about a driverless airplane carrying nuclear weapons?
No, not so much. Agree.
There you go.
Agree on. Okay, we'll talk about that next week. General Deptula, General David Deptula, is the Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Follow him on Twitter. It's really a great feed, @Deptula_David.